Yeah, so when you guys have your reference, there's a good chance the reference will not match up. It may not be exact, so I'm going to just talk briefly about that. So you can use Photoshop. A lot of times it's actually useful to line up your two profile photos and one of the straight ahead views. But you can't completely depend on that either. So I'm going to just pick some of these portraits that I know work relatively well. So yeah, some people, their heads are tilted to the left, to the right, or they're tilted on an axis, meaning their head isn't fully centered. So I'll take Julian here, I guess. So yeah, I usually wind up taking the front view and the two side views, and I like to usually line them up with Photoshop. Now the rest, like I said, you won't necessarily get pure 100% accuracy because there may be shifts in perspective, and a shift in perspective can warp or make the surface look different, right? So that's one thing you have to look out for, are those kind of shifts or changes in the perspective. The other thing is, if we're taking a look at the image, so I'm going to actually make this canvas size double the width. So go to canvas size, actually triple the width. So I'm going to go to percentage and make this 300% wider, just to start. And then I can, I'm going to just sort of quickly select the background area, and then flip the selection around, copy that, and paste it in. Should be pasted in here somewhere. There he is. So if you're taking your shots fairly well, then this actually is going to be a pretty easy thing to do. If you got a lot of background noise in your room or wherever you're taking these shots, then you might have a harder time sort of selecting your images. But you know, these were took with a pretty good camera, pretty good lighting setup. I'm just going to crop this down. So I'm going to hold Alt and crop from the center, basically. There we go. Next up, I may want to actually edit the background image too. You don't have to, but it's something I often do. So I'm using just the quick select brush, holding Shift where I want to kind of remove stuff. And let me just turn off these other layers. And if it's grabbing too much of something, I'll hold Alt, let's say, to kind of bring it back in, depending on whether you're selecting the background or the foreground. So this is kind of the Smart Select, Smart Wand brush, which is pretty useful, pretty accurate. Instead of deleting too, a lot of times I'll use a layer mask just to kind of quickly cut things out. And then I may just put a quick background layer as well. So let's take a look here. So I've cut off the front of his shirt there, but that's okay. I'm going to hit Control R, and what Control R does is puts in guides, or you can go to Windows, View, and then I believe it's Show Guides, Smart Guides. And once that's there, if you simply grab from one of the top or left-hand rule bars, you can actually drag out what I basically use as a reference, series of references. So I grab the top of the brows, the base of the nostrils, maybe the middle line of the lips, the lower line of the lower lip, the bottom of the sort of front part of the chin. So this is pretty good. This image here needs to actually be rotated, right? Because, like I said, his head was tilted, so it wasn't quite level. Or, you know, maybe in general you tend to lean to one side. So that's something you have to look for. And I often will put a center line down. In this case, sometimes there's this thing called snapping, which prevents you from dragging a guide down the center line. These guides, by the way, they're only visible in Photoshop. So, and you can turn the visibility off and on. But for now, I'm going to turn off snapping, so it doesn't snap to the dead center. I want to just manually move this line to the dead center of the face. There we go. Okay, so things are relatively level. They're lined up. You can see on this right image that head is not quite lined up, so maybe it actually needs to be tilted or rotated forward, right? So this is sometimes an issue that you don't consider, but the head may have shifted while moving from left to right, turning around. Sometimes people have an expression, that expression then changes. So these are things you have to kind of keep in mind, and if you're kind of going back and forth and saying, oh, this doesn't work, that doesn't work, that's probably why, right? Because you're paying attention to maybe one aspect of one reference, and then in another it looks different, and that's because it is different. You know, you have to take into consideration that, yeah, some of this stuff may be shifting from one photo to the next. So you may have to say, okay, I'm only going to stick with the front-facing reference or a left or a right side for this. The other thing is your face is not perfectly symmetrical. So an example of this, by the way, is if I take this image, let's take the marquee tool, right? By the way, the shortcut to hide and unhide guides is Control semicolon, so you can hide and unhide those guides. So I can hit Control C, Control V to paste, and then I'm going to hit Control T, which is basically a transform tool, and hit negative 100 and move that off on this side. So here's the thing. Now the shading looks weird, right? But as you can see, the face isn't necessarily 100% symmetrical. So there may be shifts in the cranial structure. You know, this could be a perspective issue as well. There are a lot of reasons why the left side and the right will not work. So yeah, if you find yourself going in circles for a while, that's not necessarily abnormal, because maybe you're paying attention to the right brow and the right eye, and then you start looking at the left brow and the left eye, and it matches one, but then it stops matching the other. Well, that's because you're asymmetrical. And again, the same thing can happen. So if it's a good exercise to do just to see, you know, copy one side, paste it and reverse it, and then copy the other, copy, paste. And then I'll hit, yeah, negative 100 here. And then I'll slide this over. Right, so you can get some very different looks based on that alone. There. So, yeah, and I think this is in part maybe because the head's turning a little bit to the left or turning to the right. I guess in this case it's probably turning to the right, since it seems like I'm seeing more of the right side of the face. So like I said, you have to kind of keep that in mind, and this is why I recommend everybody gets a mirror as much as you possibly can. Get a half decent mirror. It's a couple bucks at the dollar store across the street. But yeah, if you need to sort of set up your images, this is a good way to do it. And you can also, if you want as well, on a separate layer, extra layer, go in, create maybe a red brush, simple straight ahead red brush. And if you really want to, you can start to say, oh, I'm going to kind of just highlight, you know, some of these lines in the face, right, that I can find. This is a protrusion, right, this line here. You can almost make it a cartoony kind of outline, right, and say, oh, this is the line I need to follow. There's an indentation here. There's a bulge here. Okay, bulge here. Crease line here, right? Very definitive fold here. There's usually an underhang here, so this is kind of receding, and then it sort of arcs up and out. So we're looking at that in profile, right? It's sort of like, yeah, the basic version, and usually there's an angle. So that's looking at the face pointing rightwards, right? So yeah, these are sort of useful things to do. Again, there's sort of a bulge here. This is pretty standard. There is a bulging muscle area here. Okay, crease line. So yeah, if you wanted to do a pass where you're kind of, you know, marking this stuff up, then you can obviously do that. This is a very deep area as well, this recessed area. So, anyways, those are just a few kind of pointers for, you know, lining up your reference. And I think it's a bad thing, personally, to stick religiously to the photo reference because, as I said, the perspective is constantly shifting. So what you want to do is look at the 3/4 views. The 3/4 views are extremely useful because when you're turning the model around and looking at it from different angles, right, you can now take a look at this and say, oh, this is what's happening on the back side of the cheek and the chin and what that angle should be. So I often check and cross-check the references, left side, right side, 3/4 view, front and back. So that's why I have you guys do the full turn. because now you can see the sort of silhouette from not just a straight perspective view, or sorry, a straight profile front and back view, but from a 3/4 view, and it gives you a better sense of the shape and volume that's there, right? You can sort of see that sort of slope. Again, detail in the neck and the chin, right? We got this sort of fatty tissue pad here, the Adam's apple. There's these kind of long muscles coming down from the neck. Okay, and you can also mark up your scrunchy face photo as well. So that's one thing. Yeah, the other thing is there's a really great piece of software that you can download for references called Kuadro. It's not installed because basically all you need to do is download and run it. So I'm going to just simply download it. And I'll show you how this works. It's pretty great. So you basically click on it. It runs over in the bottom right corner of your computer. And you simply need to right click and say add local image. And this is totally portable, so you can bring these images with you. So I'm just going to grab the first few references. Kind of quickly opens them. So what you can do is left click and drag, and it moves all the different references where you want. If you grab the corners, you can resize the image. And if you middle mouse wheel scroll up and down, or middle mouse click and drag, you can kind of pan it left to right, up and down, zoom in, frame it exactly how you want. And what you can do is keep this with you and the app, and you go save as, and it creates a kind of file for Kuadro, which is called a ref file. So it remembers the images, as long as you keep the images in the same folder as this. It remembers the layout. So let's say I go back to, I think I may have closed Zbrush, unfortunately, but I'll just relaunch it. But what's great about this is then you can say, oh, I'm going to really focus on this like front 3/4 view, right? So I'll get it to the right sort of framing that I want. You know, I'll just open up one of these, sure. So you can do the see-through method in Zbrush, where you kind of see through if you like, and try to match that way, which is great. You know, so you can try to match things up in that sense, or you can turn this off and say, I want to just keep this floating as a reference right on top of Zbrush. So you can right click and say always on top. Now that image will always be floating on the interface, on top of the interface of any software, no matter what, until you right click and turn that off. Okay, so it's a really, really useful tool. I find it a little bit better in a lot of ways than some of the other ways we can reference in Zbrush. And this is what I was saying too. You know, I think you need to train your brain to kind of look, observe, and then bring that observation back over to the sculpt. Okay, so don't be fully dependent on just tracing, essentially, because that's not necessarily going to help you either. Because remember, you have to interpret these shapes through the filter of perspective, and the perspective may not exactly match the camera, right? The perspective from Zbrush to the camera may be different. So just keep those things in mind, and that'll, I think, help you get better as you go with this project.